Welcome everyone to this Policy and Practice seminar hosted by the UCL Department of Political Science and the School of Public Policy and the UCL Policy Lab. My name is Robert Hazel and I'm a professor in the Department of Political Science here at UCL, and I'm your chair for this evening. The title of tonight's seminar is Do Economic Sanctions Work? It's very timely. Some of you may have noticed only yesterday President Trump announced introducing sanctions against Russia's two biggest oil firms. You may not have noticed he was following an example of a decision made by the British government last week. Anyway, sanctions are in the news, and they are a tool of modern diplomacy against rogue states like Afghanistan, North Korea, Russia, Iran. One of the important weapons in terms of foreign policy, and they don't just take the form of prohibiting trade in certain goods, but also in freezing assets, in impounding ships and other property, and they can be imposed not only against states or oil companies, but also against individuals, high-profile individuals like Roman Abramovich. But I think it's right, Olga, that there are over 5,000 individuals currently sanctioned by the UK government. And the questions that our panel are going to be answering tonight are: how effective are sanctions? How easily are they circumvented? And what is their impact on the countries targeted? And to answer that question, we have three very experienced practitioners. Our first is Olga Dimitrescu from the British Treasury, and she works in their Office of Financial Sanctions. Give me the last bit. Implementation. I knew there was an I. Thank you. And next, Cina, who is a practicing lawyer and an expert in sanctions, going back many years.
20 now.
And Chloe, remind us of the name of your law firm.
It's Cina Fernandez.
Thank you.
I'm the Cina in Cina Fernandez.
And last, and a late entry, is Victoria Flowers, who stepped in only today because the third speaker, who was going to be with us, emailed me this morning to say she's unwell. So very special welcome to Victoria. And Victoria, you are an international forensic and compliance expert, which you may need to explain when it's your turn. And you're a founding partner of Koios Global.
Yes.
So those are our three speakers. And just before I hand over to Olga, who's going to go first, let me tell you the usual drill. Each of them is going to speak for just 5 or 7 minutes at the start. We're then going to have a little discussion amongst the panel with me asking them questions. But then it'll be your turn, and I promise we'll have about half an hour for Q&A. So as they talk, think of your questions, and when it is your turn, we'll take questions in groups of 3 in the usual way. So that's the form. Over now to Olga to tell us about the UK government's policy on sanctions and what she does in the Treasury. Olga, you're very welcome. Over to you.
Thanks very much. So as Robert has already introduced me, my name is Olga and I work in HM Treasury, the Office of Financial Sanctions Implementation. Now, in terms of my professional journey, I have been working in sanctions since 2022, when I moved from the financial markets part of the Treasury into the sanctions bit. And it's quite interesting because I think my professional journey reflects a little bit a pretty basic reality about sanctions. The fact that they were not hugely visible in the media until the invasion of Ukraine. And now they are fairly visible, which is also why we're here tonight. And also, we are asking all sorts of questions. Like, what is the purpose of sanctions? How are they formulated? Do they actually work? And what I'm going to do is try and answer at a very high level these questions, and also in answering these questions, hopefully it will bring a little bit of clarity in terms of what the Treasury does, what the government does, what the UK government does in this space. So in a most general sense, sanctions are a tool of economic statecraft. They help deliver foreign policy goals without kinetic action. by which we mean military intervention. We use them to induce behavior change. And for the UK in particular, we conceptualize sanctions as having three broad aims: deter, disrupt, and demonstrate. This is part of the FCDO sanction strategy. So, deter malign actors and undesirable behavior, disrupt said behavior and the activity of malign actors, and demonstrate our commitment to international norms. So, deter, disrupt, demonstrate. Now, when do we actually want to use sanctions? Usually it's because something happens. So, there's either war breakout, or there's a military coup, or there's maybe illegal development of nuclear weapons. And so the UK government, other governments may do that as well, but I'm speaking on behalf of the UK government, so we want to respond. Now, there's a few policy tools available. We can issue a statement, we can expel some diplomats, we could maybe provide military support, or we could deploy sanctions, or of course a combination of these tools. We tend to use them fairly complementary to each other. We tend to be quite selective and proportional about what we do as part of a broader strategy. But let's just say that we have decided to use sanctions, and we're going to focus on that part. We now need to decide what kind of sanction. Now, this is usually determined by the context that we find ourselves in, the policy aim, the policy levers available, the target country or the target individual that we want to focus on. So there's lots of choices available. Broadly speaking, and I'm hugely simplifying here, there's travel bans, there's export controls, trade embargoes, you will have definitely heard of those, and also financial sanctions, which I'm going to focus in a moment because that's really what the Treasury does. But before I do that, just a quick detour to explain a little bit how government works in terms of sanctions, the mapping of the sanctions landscape in government. The Foreign Office is the department responsible for sanctions, for setting the sanctions policy across the board. They have the largest sanctions remit. And then next to the Foreign Office, there's HMT, and we focus on financial sanctions. And within OFSI, the Office of Financial Sanctions Implementation, which is an arm of HM Treasury, we focus on the policy implementation and enforcement of sanctions. This is because we want to make sure that sanctions policy doesn't just exist as policy, but is actually implemented and complied with by the private sector. So what we do is make sure that the business community within the UK and also outside of it, to the extent that they interact with the UK jurisdiction, we want to make sure that they are compliant with our regulations. And if they're not, we open an investigation which can result in enforcement action. We also have other partners across government, in the Home Office, Department for Business and Trade, DCMS, Ministry of Defence and so on. Internationally, so all of us together, we work with our like-minded partners, the EU Commission, the United States, the G7, and other partner countries. But then, this is kind of like where it gets interesting from a policy cycle perspective. We also need to work with firms, different sectors. I'm primarily looking at banking, insurance, law firms, but there's also NGOs, there's also academia. And the reason for that is because unlike traditional, if you will, foreign policy, sanctions require a very close partnership between states and the private sector for effective implementation. Because when you look at foreign policy in terms of treaties, they just require two different states to agree at government level, intergovernmental level. But when it comes to sanctions, you need to make sure that they actually bite by working with the private sector. And if you don't do that, then there will be you can see examples of circumvention or inadvertent breaches. And so the point is, sanctions is a very broad landscape, and there are lots of actors that need to coordinate with each other, which is also why it's not just me here talking tonight. We're also looking at the private sector and different parts of it. And so, very quickly, in terms of how sanctions work, because and I'm going to focus in particular on financial sanctions because that is my remit. So at their core, financial sanctions prohibit UK nationals and legal entities from undertaking specific activities. The legal definition is a bit more complex, but this is the broad gist. We're effectively saying, don't work with X bank, or don't accept funds from Y person. Or if a particular oligarch maybe has several bank accounts with UK banks, the UK government can block access to those bank accounts. And so we don't confiscate their assets without due process, because that would be unlawful. But we can ensure that they can't use those bank accounts and those funds in any meaningful way. And so in particular for the UK, this is one of our most effective policy levers: travel bans and asset freezes. They tend to bite the most, which isn't to say that they can't be deployed as part of a broader strategy with complementary tools, but in particular for the Treasury, we find that they're particularly effective. One of the reasons why I'm saying that is because oligarchs, at a very basic level, Russian oligarchs, they like living in London, and so a travel ban tends to impact their lifestyle quite directly. And they also like spending money in London or abroad. And so to the extent that we're able to interfere with their lifestyle and introduce significant friction, then that is a way to induce behavior change. And so this is why the UK government deploys financial sanctions extensively. Pretty much any international transfer, even if it doesn't bank transfer, even if it doesn't involve, on the face of it, UK bank accounts, it tends to be processed by a UK located bank. So even if we have two different countries, you'd say, like two different accounts that connect to each other, some transactions that you say, oh, but there's no pounds there's nothing in the UK. That in and of itself doesn't necessarily mean that the UK banking system is not being touched by that particular transaction. And at the point where it's touched, that's where we say, okay, you need to block the funds, you need to freeze the funds, block the transaction, and report to OFSI, so to HM government. And so that's, as a whole, it means that we can weaponize the UK financial sector as a choke point effectively, and deny malign actors the opportunity to leverage our financial services. In terms of how sanctions, whether they work, the answer is they work, but cumulatively. This isn't a case of you designate Putin today, he's going to resign tomorrow as a result of the sanctions. So I would like to push back slightly, preemptively push back against that particular metric, which tends to come up quite a lot. People say, oh, but sanctions aren't necessarily effective purely because you can't see direct regime change. And that's not something that we would reject that. What we say is the impact is very much cumulative. The cost of war is causing economic strain. There is currently a budgetary crisis in Russia. Financial position is worsening. We know that their economic growth is decelerating because you look at their interest rates, for instance. The interest rate in Russia at the moment is something over 21%. We're at 4%. Imagine 21%. That is a big impact. And so having to divest economic resources from productive economic sectors and towards the military-industrial complex, that harms prospects in the medium and long term. And without sanctions, and this is just some fun facts for you, without sanctions, Russia would have about $400 billion more in revenue to fund the war, and this in turn benefits Ukraine, because we are in a position to say, right, so Russia is not quite as able to wage war as it would be otherwise. And I agree that this is a counterfactual, but remember that if we cast our minds back to 2022, Ukraine was supposed to last for 2 weeks, and yet here we are, it is 2025 and the war is not over. So that in and of itself shows that sanctions have an impact. We've frozen over 23 billion of Russian assets only within the UK, and we've sanctioned several thousand of individuals and entities. This has a cumulative impact at macro level, but also at micro level, as I mentioned before. If you look at travel bans, this doesn't sit with the Treasury, but more broadly, travel and visa bans, even if there's not an immediate impact, visible impact to us, you can still see that the lifestyles of the people that have a direct decision-making powers, or very, very close to that, over the war in Ukraine on the Russian side, they are impacted. There are consequences. And so this brings me to the final bit in terms of circumvention. We also accept that there will always be some degree of circumvention. We agree that to a very large extent, malignant actors will always have an incentive to circumvent sanctions. But what we can do, especially in OFSI, as the operational arm of HM Treasury, we counter circumvention through research and through analysis. We share information with law enforcement, so there's NCA, there's agencies, there's lots of other, not just regulators, but bodies that have powers to interact with the sector. We can also impose monetary penalties. And we also look at working with our international partners to build their own capacity and technical expertise. And so many of these international partners, they've introduced measures to limit the export of sanctioned goods, and we have seen this impact trade flows. And so even if there is some residual circumvention, first of all, we're tackling that, and we've been quite successful at that. I have some numbers, but you can imagine that we have been quite successful so far in limiting circumvention via the UK. But even for the residual elements of it, I would say that it is costlier, it is slower, and it introduces more uncertainty. And so what we're trying to do is make the environment less hospitable. We want to make sure that malign actors, even though they exist, we can influence and the incentives and behavior of other firms, and we can make sure that in that sense we limit their opportunities to flout financial sanctions imposed by the UK. And so, bringing this to a conclusion, because I'm conscious I've been talking for a long time, sanctions are a very useful tool because they sit at the intersection of diplomacy, law, and macroeconomic policy. And I think that they will become more and more central to foreign policy in the decades to come, especially in the globalized world that we all live in.
Thanks, Olga. Great introduction. One very simple question. How big is OFSI? How many staff in your bit of the Treasury?
It's about 130,
Wow.
give and take.
That's
Yeah.
big.
We started with 30 before the invasion, so we went from 30 to 130 in 3 years.
Right. Yeah. So Russia and Ukraine clearly is very much in the forefront
Absolutely.
of a lot of the work. Okay, Chloe.
Great. Well,
lawyers.
the lawyers. Well, I wear many hats. I should have come in one of my beanies, but it's not quite cold enough for that yet. But thanks, Olga. That was a really good overview from an HMG official, and they're obviously quite constrained. I was a former Foreign Office legal advisor. I think I was a maverick then, and now I'm doing all sorts of things, including I'm a senior associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, so I can pretty much, I'm told to fly the flag of RUSI and say whatever I like. But with that in mind, I think I didn't prepare anything for this because I wanted to firstly thank you. I think it's great that you're all staying this late and are interested in sanctions because I've been doing them for like 20 years and they weren't sexy at all. The reason I got into national security was because it was seen as financial, technical, a bit geeky, and nobody in the government wanted to do it. And of course, this is one thing I say to young people, which was said to me many years ago, is if you want to succeed in life, carve yourself a niche. Now, you don't know if that niche will ever work out, but certainly for me, sanctions is an area where I've been able to carve myself a niche. I think one thing Olga said was she talked a little bit about who has to comply with UK sanctions. I'm going to touch upon sanctions with a bit more of a global hat as I can, but how many of you in this room are UK persons that need to comply with UK sanctions? Brilliant. Go on. Is this all? We just got 2 at the back. Okay, so you're, apart from those 2, all of you, if you found yourself in a situation where you had to ask yourself whether or not you were to comply with UK sanctions, for whatever reason it may be, you're all wrong, because when you're in the UK, just like when you're in the US, you are a UK person or a US person and you have to comply. You know, you can't just drive a car at European speed limits in the UK, can you? Because you're not a UK citizen, and that's why I decided to give you a little bit of a trick question and wake you up and make you feel awkward. But anyway, all of you need to comply when you're in the UK. Of course, if some of you, and I'm sure by the answers we got, are not UK nationals, when you leave the UK, so long as you don't have a citizenship here, then of course you wouldn't need to comply with UK nationals. But whilst you're here, UK sanctions, but whilst you're here, you do need to. There is one other office that you didn't refer to, which is the Office of Trade Sanctions, right? Which is OTSI. It's a kind of sister of OFSI. We're not really sure what it's doing yet. It sort of opened its doors last October the 10th, 2024, and hasn't really done that much other than publish some guidance and said that it's going to be responsible for trade sanctions in the UK, which after January will also include all of the licensing for goods as well, so sort of export controls, dual use goods, military goods, etc. But it's going to have a new role, and it's actually going to be the only, we say, Office of Trade Sanctions in Europe or in the wider Western sort of sphere, because we don't actually have that elsewhere. But what that's actually achieved in the UK is kind of almost a blurring of lines, and one of the reasons we have that is we used to talk strictly about financial sanctions, and then you had arms embargoes, and somewhere in between you had sort of export controls that sort of fitted into that. But now we actually have a merging of all of that, and we have financial sanctions and trade sanctions and export controls, which are sometimes found within the same regulations, which makes it slightly harder because you can't be a purist. You have to actually cover all of these different areas. And that's really because if you think about what happened on the 24th of February 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine for the second time, we found that we needed to have, certainly in all of the different regulations, the combination of both financial sanctions, applying pressure on Russia's war chest and restricting its ability to access revenue at the rate it would have been able to had we not had those sanctions in place, but also the restrictions on exports, because there's two main objectives with the sanctions we see, not just in the UK but across the G7 nations, which is trying to restrict Russia's access to revenue, but also trying to restrict its access to the critical goods. You would have heard of critical goods, high priority goods. They're basically the goods that will allow it to continue its war effort, or some say those goods that are found on the battlefields in Ukraine. And that can be anything from construction machinery, like big diggers. I'm not going to name the name of an article that's going to be published in the Financial Times soon, but a UK company. But, you know, construction vehicles that will be used to dig trenches and mass graves, and also, you know, the semiconductors that will be used in drones, and we've seen a huge amount of this new drone warfare. And, of course, some of those restrictions in the UK, in the US, in the EU, and indeed other jurisdictions like Canada, are aimed at restricting Russia's access to those critical goods. But sanctions aren't just about Russia. We always seem to focus on it, and that's because we get newbies. You said you were doing financial services before 2022, and of course, if you're running a new team with individuals who've not really done sanctions prior to 2022, their main book of knowledge will be around Russia. And that's excellent, because if you find it in Russia, you'll pretty much find it in another regime thereafter. But we need to go back to, I mean, sanctions go back decades, but if we start maybe in the Al-Qaeda sanctions, which were the terrorist sanctions that really took off after the Twin Towers and the attacks we saw in the US and 9/11. And those sanctions had a very specific objective, and that was to reduce terrorism and acts of terrorist activities in Western countries. So I think just giving you sort of very brief overview of the different types of reasons behind, or the foreign policy objectives behind sanctions, you'll see that we've got the terrorist regimes, we've got misappropriation regimes. All of you are probably too young, although you may have studied it, to remember the Arab Spring. I'm assuming you were still in primary school or the equivalent, but the Arab Spring started in 2011, and there we had a number of different misappropriation regimes, and those regimes, very different from terrorists, very different from the Russia regime we see now, or indeed Iran, which I'll come on to because it's now relevant again. But the misappropriation regimes, I find some of them to be most fascinating, especially Libya, because Libya was all about preserving the assets that had been misappropriated by the Gaddafi regime and retained outside of Libya. And the idea about preserving those assets would be one day in the future, when there would be political stability, which we still haven't got to, those assets would be returned to the Libyan people because they come from the public purse, and they would be used to rebuild, hospitals and critical infrastructure and schools, etc. There's around about 100 billion of Libyan assets, and this was 2011, bearing in mind, are still sitting outside, frozen in accounts around the world, because they haven't. The West hasn't agreed that there's a sufficient political stability to be able to repatriate those assets. But that's a misappropriation regime. And then you get the nuclear regimes. We get the two big ones are obviously North Korea, DPRK, which is pretty much a comprehensive regime across everything, and then the Iranian regime. And I think the Iranian regime is great because it's now come back round in full cycle and we're all interested in it again. And it was what actually got me interested at the time in sanctions. Just started in it with a UN Security Council resolution in 2006 and sort of went on to a comprehensive set of sanctions measures from 2010 to 2012. And in 2014, and this will be my point about whether or not sanctions are effective, was the beginning of the Iran negotiations. I'm sure you will have heard about them because they're in the press more and more often in the last sort of 6 months than previously. But the Iran negotiations was when the P5+1, I'm sure you all know that because you're doing international relations, but the P5+1 was basically under a negotiating regime with the Iranians, and the impact of the sanctions, which has exerted so much economic pressure on the regime, brought the Iranians with the idea that sanctions at one point may be lifted if they agreed to certain conditions being imposed. And it's all about the inspection of their nuclear sites. And so from 2014 to 2016, we had partial lifting of Iranian sanctions to test the waters. I think you were talking about buy-in from the private sector. There's buy-in from the private sector, which is about complying with sanctions, but then with the Iran lifting of sanctions, buy-in actually was about the private sector going back in and helping the Iranians and generating economic activity so they could have a taste of what it was like if sanctions were going to be lifted as part of the full nuclear deal, which is the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Now, of course, that resulted in the agreement, which began on the 16th of January 2016, implementation day, with a whole raft of different stages to do with the reduction of Iran's nuclear program, changing it from a military program to a civilian program, which actually ended up being torn up on the 6th of May 2018 by the first Trump administration. And that was kind of the end of the Iran nuclear deal, as we now call it. I think, as a Foreign Office legal advisor working on Iran at the time, it was bound to fail because we basically had primary sanctions that remained in place, that were administered by the US. And as part of the deal, the only thing that the US conceded, they had red lines that they were prepared not to go over, was the lifting of secondary sanctions. Now, that's a level of technical detail which I think I may, when you come back and ask a question, what's the difference between primary and secondary sanctions? So one of you can ask that question, give you some detail about it. But I'm going to stop there and move on to Victoria, who'll give you, well, first explain what your job title is, right?
Yes, exactly. So first,
I don't know if it was working, but
I think so. Can you hear me? Yes. All right, good. So thank you as well for coming here and giving us the opportunity to talk about sanctions, the most exciting topic these days. So going on to what do I do? So forensics investigations, due diligence, compliance, and risk management. That's a huge sentence. And basically what it means is that we work with organizations that to help them prevent, detect, and react to any kind of infractions that deal with financial crime, sanctions, circumvention, evasions, and things of the like. So I would be working with organizations to help ensure that their compliance infrastructure is well equipped with the appropriate controls to ensure that if somehow organizations or individuals try to evade sanctions coming into either the financial system or have some kind of a trade organization enact any type of business that would be classified as sanctioned activity, that they're able to catch it and detect it. Means that once all of this is in place and their people are trained and their systems are in, and it's still somehow, because these people are really smart, they do manage to get into the system, that the organizations are able to actually detect that activity and hopefully stop it. And as I said, people are very smart in trying to get their money out or their business to keep going. They do still manage to somehow get through. And when that happens, to actually react to that threat, to react to that activity, and respond. So whether that leads to an investigation that may end up in court, so you need to provide the appropriate evidence that is court admissible. And our organization provides the intelligence, whether that be in on the ground human intelligence in far off places, even in risky and sanctioned countries, where they can go in and identify if in fact this particular organization is working when they shouldn't be, trading when they shouldn't be, and make sure that we've got the evidence to provide the lawyers and the legal counsel and the organizations to actually enact that legal case. So if I go back to the question of are sanctions effective? Well, frankly, from where I sit and I see far too many investigations that are taking place because they haven't worked, because there are so many ways that they can actually circumvent these sanctions, such as you have the black knight countries. So we have a pharmaceutical company. Thomas said that I should use anecdotes. So I have a pharmaceutical company who is a client, and they want to deliver goods, their drugs, to Iran or to Russia. Unfortunately, they can't do that because the banks can't pay them. They won't accept money. So what they do is they go to Turkey or they'll go to Dubai and get a third-party distributor and sell it to that particular distributor, who then will turn around and sell it to Iran. But even when that happens, getting that payment, banks are getting smarter and they know that actually it is kind of a diversion. It's going through a third country and they're preventing it, but there's ways to actually get around that as well, because what I've seen is they'll use shell companies. They'll use straw men. I have another, it's an agriculture company, and technically they are allowed to trade with Russia, with Iran, because it is a product that is necessary for the livelihood of the individuals from these sanctioned countries. So it's allowed, but not if it's owned more than a certain percentage by a sanctioned individual. So what does that individual do? He still maintains the ownership, but he ensures that he's got family members that are not necessarily related to a close enough level that they can be identified as straw men, and they'll have their ownership just below the threshold of, let's say, 25%. I think that's moving now to 50%, but 25%, so that they are not impacted. And so if an organization does do their sanctions check, they'll find out that perhaps, Abramovich is an owner ultimately, but it's an owner that has been watered down to such a degree that it is no longer an issue for that organization, and it's not preventing them from actually trading. I have one who, the company is in Switzerland, and they have managed to get individuals that have Swiss citizenships that are running the company. I mean, they are definitely making more than $1 billion a year, and the ultimate owner is a highly sanctioned individual. And everybody knows that. But the laws are just not tight enough in a way to actually prevent that because of the way that the ownership has been watered down. Another, I think, out for them is crypto, using crypto banks. And there again, the wealth is so abundant that they can buy a citizenship in Portugal. So even though we know that that individual is the actual trader, and he is Russian and he should be sanctioned, but he has a Portuguese citizenship, and that allows him to trade. So when I think about who and what is the impact of sanctions, I think, what is your objective? Is your objective to end the war in Russia? If that is the objective, then sanctions don't work. According to you, I think Olga's comment, from 2 weeks, which was expected to last, 3 years. Does Putin care? Not at all. Maybe he does because he doesn't have as much money as he needs in order to move the war faster and broader. But, I mean, technically, it's not his pocket that's actually being sanctioned. It's the people that are impacted, that live there. It's the oligarchs where their money is frozen. And you would think that that pressure, that peer pressure, and, the individuals that have those assets would put pressure on Putin. But there is also an element of rally around the flag, kind of component where, you see your country is being, maybe in their mind, unfairly targeted because you believe in this war. So you're going to find ways to get around that. You're going to find perhaps NGOs, using NGOs where they end up, donating funds and diverting that fund back to the war chest. So there are ways to get around it. And as I think about that, question in itself is that does it work? Did Russia stop the war? No. So just purely on that point alone, does it work? I would say no. But is it necessary? So that's the flip side to the coin. Yes, it's necessary because, first of all, it's the countries that are the world that's making a stand, and they're saying this is not acceptable, and we will punish you. I mean, we can't go to war with you right now. We don't want to go to war with you right now, but we are going to show you that we're going to make this really difficult, and we're going to impact every aspect of your life that we can. And hope that that would be enough to at least get them to the table to talk, to negotiate, to somehow come to an agreement. But so far, Trump's tried several times with Putin, and that has gone nowhere because, once again, it's Putin doesn't care. He's got an objective in mind, and he's not the one who's actually hurting inside, in my opinion. I mean, of course, I don't have the filters that you guys do. I don't have any licenses to worry about or anything like that, and I can say what I think. And from that standpoint, I think that there's still different ways and maybe more effective ways that we can get a more reasonable outcome. When you're trying to change something that is of that magnitude, so a regime change, we talked about it earlier, to end the war, I think that's too big of an objective. I think smaller, more moderate objectives, more moderate points to kind of get to that level eventually. But let's first start, okay, we're not going to do this. We're going to, put sanctions on you unless come up with an idea, of something that is more moderate that you can get them to agree to. And a negotiation training that I had once, they said, when you go and you sit down at the negotiation table, first of all, you have to know what your end game is, what your bottom line is. Keep something that you pretend that is really, really important for you, but it's really not. You're willing to give it away. Something that you absolutely will not give away, and something that you'll easily give away. And when you have those three levels, then, and you go into that negotiation table, and you make something, perhaps present something that is really, really important to you, but it really is not, and maybe kind of apply sanctions in the same way. You're sitting down at the table, and you're really asking for this, but you're willing to settle for this. And maybe that works. Then the next time around, try to get a little further ahead using perhaps the sanctions. But for me, I think more than anything, it's not really to negotiate. I think it's more to make a stand, to present to the world that we are not in agreement with this and we're going to make life difficult for you.
Very good. Can I have the microphone? Thank you. The great introductions. We're going to have a panel discussion for about 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up to the floor. I'm going to ask initially, forgive me, some rather basic questions. We've talked a lot, primarily about Russia and Ukraine and so on. But do you know how many countries around the world are currently the target of UK sanctions?
I think we have about 36 regimes at the moment, which some of them are thematic, but I think it's somewhere between 30 and 50, I would say.
And are most sanctions multilateral in the sense that the UK is acting in concert with other friendly countries, or do we sometimes impose sanctions unilaterally?
I think it's a mix, really. Some of them are multilateral, such as your price cap, which is currently in the news. There are others that we impose bilaterally, which is why occasionally firms come to us and they say, okay, and they say, right, so there's this particular UK sanction against a particular target, but it's not reflected in EU sanctions. And that is a challenge of the international system. Obviously, we try to work through multilateral fora as much as possible and work with our international partners, but it is a mix, really.
Can I explain that as a lawyer? And forgive me. So, multilateral sanctions come from the UN. We don't see very many of them anymore because of Russia's right to veto and China's too. But multilateral sanctions from the UN are binding on all 193 member states. And at the time when they were effective, let's take Iran, they would have been preferable to use. Of course, we couldn't have ever had them used in the context of Russia. The EU has its own set of multilateral sanctions because they are also binding on the EU 27. Now, some of those will be directly effective from their UN obligations, but in the context of multilateral for the EU, you will have EU autonomous and EU semi-autonomous, as well as those that they are required to implement because of their UN obligations. So the EU autonomous regimes would be Russia, because there are no equivalents in the UN, and a semi-autonomous would be where they've implemented some of their UN obligations, but they've gone a bit further with what their foreign policy objectives are, and they've added additional points, additional restrictions, and they would be semi-autonomous regimes. A unilateral sanctions regime will be the US, or the UK, which will be its own sanctioning authority. Post-Brexit, the UK became a unilateral sanctions authority where it's pursuing its own foreign policy objectives, even if it is aligned or working in concert with another authority, such as the EU. Does that clarify things?
Yeah. And coming to the question of enforcement, are sanctions always intended to be effective, or are they sometimes a grand gesture? And let's take Trump's announcement of yesterday as a case study. Is that simply a grand gesture, or will there be follow-through and active enforcement? Who wants to go first on that? Over here, perhaps. You've got your own microphone.
Okay. Yeah, sorry. I mean, from my standpoint, I can see Chloe actually shaking her head. But from my standpoint, I think it is a grand gesture. As I said, no, you don't think so. It's good. We have a debate.
Yep. You go first, Victoria, and then Chloe can respond.
As I said even in my presentation earlier, is that I believe that sanctions is, or sanctions are a way for the world to say, you know, we do not agree with what it is that's going on, right? We want you to change. We want that change, and we're going to make it difficult for you. But if you're looking at the effectiveness, when was the last time that the sanctions actually worked? I think, when was that? So you said...
It's open for debate, but I think the point about Robert's point about today's and yesterday's, because we had the 19th package
Yeah.
as well, which also had vessels and transaction bans, and also some of the entities were oil related as well. But it's not just a grand gesture. There are companies all around the world and financial institutions all around the world that have 10 days to block and report what assets they have and stop transacting immediately. And if you're thinking about the Lukoils of yesterday, I can guarantee that I had a very hot phone line today explaining what needs to be done. And it is huge what Trump has done. Absolutely. I mean, I'm surprised the UK went first. It was a bit of an odd one to see us go before the US. But Trump has actually done that in a very, very strategic, and unlike his unguided missile way of diplomacy, I think it's actually going to perhaps bring Putin to the table, because it's a message. And that message is about 8 weeks ago, Nayara, which is India's sort of biggest refinery in conjunction with Gazprom, it's kind of almost jointly owned. Basically, they had a number of démarches, which is where you get a diplomatic commission arriving at a particular country and saying, if you don't agree and you don't stop and pursue and implement our foreign policy, we're going to designate, and this was Nayara, their biggest refinery, because they were basically, and we go back to the oil price cap, they were basically facilitating what we would say was illicit Russian crude oil trade, which is what we don't want Russia to be able to do because of the access to revenue. So I don't think they're purely presentational, not after yesterday's announcements and today's with the 19th package.
I hope you're right. I just know that I had a client, again, who was providing pipes to one of those companies, actually, that was on Trump's list. And they had to stop, and they had a huge inventory worth millions. And the board agreed that they should take this inventory, send it to their China location, and China then sent it on to Russia. And they try to say that it had nothing to do with oil. It was to do with, building some other kind of machinery and whatever they can to actually make sure that they get their payment for the products that they sold. So I hope this is different, because they were able to do that too easily before.
Final tiny question from me for Olga. The UK went first on these sanctions against the Russian oil companies. Did we know that the US was going to make its announcement this week? Is there anything you can reveal about the choreography of this?
So I couldn't possibly comment. But what I can say is that we talk both at working level and senior level. And we aim to work in lockstep and operate in lockstep as much as possible. What I will also say on this, in particular on the price cap, is that you should watch this space. So there's definitely, we definitely want to take a more aggressive stance in that direction.
Very good. Now it's the turn of the audience. So I'll take questions in threes. And the first hands going up are right at the top left-hand corner. So wait for the microphone to come to you. I can see 2 hands up there. If anyone else wants to ask a question up there, raise your hand. Yes. Tell us who you are, sir.
Hi, my name is Farai. I'm from Zimbabwe originally. And so I have very, good experience with sanctions. And so my question, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, is I think the effectiveness of sanctions for bringing out, I think like Victoria said, for bringing out the actual results of the intent of, whatever goal it is, are actually very low, like historically. And they happen to affect millions of people in general. So it's almost like an elephant trying to kill an ant. So I think it may work sometimes, but it affects millions of people. I'd love to get your thoughts on whether or not you think it's still worth it to go through if millions of people are going to suffer. And part of that is also that I think now sanctions are drifting to U.S. policy, and are we allowing millions of people to suffer at the hands of U.S. foreign interests?
Okay, thank you.
Hi,
Yes.
my name is Marvin, and I'm from Cambodia, and I study PP at PPE at King's. And then my question to you is, with the rise of cryptocurrency, blockchain technology, and decentralized banking system, wouldn't that make traditional economic sanctions useless as circumvention is inevitable? That's my question.
Okay,
Thank you.
and do we have a third questioner up there? Yes.
Hi, thanks. I'm Malaika. I'm a PhD student at the LSE. I'm also Zimbabwean. So kind of building on Farai's point, I have a few questions, but just...
Just ask one, please.
Yeah, I'm picking one. Okay, so I would like to have more clarity about how much collaboration or how much back and forth is had with human rights lawyers, how much that is actually factored into sanctions or whether it is kind of constructed in a silo, and also what kind of considerations are given to things like the right to development specifically.
Right, I didn't hear the last. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, that's going to be one for you. But let's go first of all on the first question, which all of you can perhaps try to answer. So the question from Zimbabwe, as if I heard it right, was A, sanctions haven't been very ineffective, but B, to the extent that people have suffered, it's the ordinary people of Zimbabwe and not the individuals or government who were the main target of the sanctions. Olga, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. And I think this is very interesting because my academic background is political science and international relations, and so I'm also aware of the academic literature, and especially from the 90s, quite a lot of research into why particular trade embargoes, trade sanctions don't work, that being the argument in the sense that they impact the population, not the elites, so in a way they're not ethical. So I'm very familiar with those arguments from my time in university. I think with my practitioner hat on, this is actually the reason why the UK focuses, obviously not 100%, but one of our main levers is financial sanctions, because that's actually very targeted. We're not shutting down the entire financial system of an entire country. What we're doing is targeting several oligarchs and saying several elements, individuals in the elite, people that we know have decision-making powers, and we're saying, right, you will no longer have access to your bank accounts or we will disrupt your transactions. So what we're trying to do there is actually being super specific rather than impacting an entire population. I will also say very generally, of course, I can't get into a debate on this because there are some obvious limitations in terms of what I can say. But when we build a case internally, when the Foreign Office builds a case against designating, so sanctioning an individual or a legal entity or creating a regime, there are lawyers involved in that process. The process, it's very structured, it's very detailed, there's levels of clearance. These aren't decisions that are made on the hoof by a single individual. So there's quite a lot of resource and process that goes into this, particularly given that the Foreign Office has a fairly low appetite for litigation, and so to a very large extent we try to make sure that we are as robust as possible in our processes, and that we're able to effect that way. That's what I'd say.
I'm going to answer question 1 and 3 in a combined way because I feel like you're kind of saying the same thing but slightly differently. You'll see from my answer where I'm coming from. I think you're absolutely right in question 1. I was responsible I inherited the Zimbabwe portfolio back in 2014, and I think that was one of the portfolios which at the Foreign Office led because there was an awful lot of debate over the effectiveness. You know, at the point in time when you share your name with the former president was no longer in power, the question was, well, what have we got these sanctions for? What are they doing other than causing sheer socio-economic pain on the population? They're not achieving that. Trying to lift regimes isn't easy, right? It's just, you can't just, I mean, unless you're Trump and you wake up overnight and you've got Truth Social and you say we're lifting all sanctions on Syria, without even telling your advisors that's what you're going to do. And that diplomacy has changed. Politics has changed since that point in time. But Zimbabwe was definitely one of the cases which was a trigger for the review of the effectiveness of sanctions and how not to punish an entire population, right? Because it really is a case in hand. I think in terms of, and it doesn't mean that sanctions didn't harm Zimbabwe more in terms of the population than they achieved their aim. Right, I 100% agree with you, but it was one of the triggers for change. In terms of human rights, well, I'll tell you, I did my master's in human rights and democratization, and I think the Foreign Office seeks to uphold human rights where possible. Right, it's always a difficult one, but every single sanctions regime, whether it's DPRK, Iran, Syria, any of the sanctions regimes, whether they're comprehensive or targeted, will have specific exemptions or derogations which allow for the facilitation of humanitarian aid, agricultural, etc., because there shouldn't be a crisis on global food insecurity. There shouldn't be a restriction on DPRK during the COVID period, access to critical medical devices and critical medical infrastructure, etc. It doesn't work, though. Right, it's aspirational now, and why doesn't it work? It's not because government hasn't put into the regulations these specific exemptions, or the US has been really forward-leaning in its licensing. Right, you go to general licenses which allow for trade with Iran under the Swiss mechanism, but the problem is you don't get many financial institutions. I was at Deutsche Bank and we were very forward-leaning on what we permitted, but you don't get many financial institutions that are bold enough and courageous enough to facilitate the transactions. So giving you a really quick example, you take Maersk, which is a global shipping logistics supplier. Right, they want to carry containers to Syria for many, many years during the war, full of medical devices, nappies, anything you can think of that the population really should still have access to, despite the sanctions which are targeted at the regime. That's fine, but if then they aren't able to transact and be paid for any of those, even if it's humanitarian, right, you still got to pay for things like bunkering, vessels, chartering, all of those other things. And that's where the problem sits. It's not the legislation itself or the political will. It's actually within the private sector, which you need to have go hand in hand with the actual policies themselves. So I agree with both of you, but trying to give you a little bit more insight.
Could pass the microphone to Victoria. Could you just answer about crypto, the question from Cambodia? I know you partly answered it before, but expand your answer and tell us, if you can, the prevalence of using crypto, blockchain or other things.
So from my experience, and I have worked actually for quite a long time in a crypto bank in Switzerland, and we were doing high-risk reviews, and I found that the majority of the customers were either Russian or Chinese, and I mean the majority of this bank, and the majority of the funds that went through that bank were originated from Russia. In some form or fashion, either because supposedly before the sanctions there was a company that was sold and they got millions of dollars, and now they're putting it into crypto, or because some Russian very smart young man got into the crypto world at a very early stage, and within a matter of 2 years they made millions. I mean, it's just the flow of funds and the growth of assets within the crypto world is so rapid. And there are, again, so many layers, and it is transparent because, you can see the flow of the transaction, but there are so many ways of layering and so many ways of hiding who the ultimate beneficial owner is, that it is easy for them to do it. In banks, I think in many ways, they have dual kind of perspective. One is they want to comply. Certainly they don't want the fines, but at the same point in time, they're in it, to get the money. So, in the profit. So if there's a way that they can say, well, okay, I actually, can approve this because, and there's some element of because, why, they're willing to do it. I mean, there was one situation where I had an individual, an RM, the front, bringing me a client, Russian background, but with a UK citizenship, which again, now he's exempt, right? But the money, the question actually came supposedly from a company that was in the telephony industry, a Russian company in the telephony industry, which is a sanctioned industry. And they brought, their current situation from a financial standpoint, where they're currently working, their pay stubs supposedly, and you could see very, very clearly that all of this was just downloaded from the internet. I mean, completely. They're currently living. Actually, they're from the UK, originally from Russia. They're living in Dubai. And when I approached the RM, said, you cannot accept...
What is the RM?
A relationship manager, sorry. And, I actually had a real issue with this. I said, you cannot accept this. I mean, this is not authentic. This is not a legitimate pay stub. And they said, well, no, the company's in Dubai. What do you expect? They're from Dubai. As if, well, because it's Dubai, it's okay, it's acceptable to give you something less than authentic. And so relationship managers, the banks, they need a lot more training in order to be able to really prevent the evolution of, this infiltration of the financial system, and crypto is too easy.
Time for another round. And we'll come to the front, if we may. And then behind you, so if you could pass the mic back up. Tell us who you are.
I'm Matthew. I'm a former student at UCL. I'm always astounded by the fact that we're announcing a new round of sanctions on Russia, which kind of highlights to me either, that we're playing a game of whack and mole, which I accept is true, or that we weren't sort of strong enough on the first round of sanctions when we were after the invasion, when we were told, everything will be done to sanction Russia. So this brings up sort of my idea is, what is the cost of sanctions to ourselves, to the UK and the West? And is this why there's an impression that we were a bit reluctant to impose a full set of sanctions in 2022?
Good question. Right behind you.
I just wanted to ask, looking to the future of sanctions, with economies like India and China are expected to grow more rapidly than the West. The West is stuck in this stagnative state at the moment, and everyone's promising growth and not delivering. But in China and India, their economies are expected to grow much faster than in the West. And you have the BRICS alliance, which seems to be getting stronger and stronger by the day. Looking to the future, maybe decades in the future, are sanctions that the West, who seem to be more outwardly committed to international law, at what point do they become completely ineffective because China and India can just uphold any ally?
Thank you. And the third question in this corner of the room, if we have one. I think going to the lady in white in about row 5. Could you pass the mic across? Yes.
It's interesting to hear the contrast between Chloe's comments about how businesses are so in the mindset of sanctions that they find it difficult to lift it for humanitarian reasons, and then Victoria's comments about how it's so easy to circumvent them that they're sort of ineffective. And so I think it brings this wider question of, do you think the greater prevalence of sanctions in popular discourse and in popular media about international relations are creating this idea that they're a quick fix to the biggest problem of the war in Ukraine, and to what extent has the expectations of sanctions in popular discourse and popular understanding changed over the last few years or the last decade?
Very good. Olga, I'll come to you first again. So, in particular, the first question, can sanctions be self-harming to the country imposing them, and is that a constraint?
So again, I think I speak this very much with my HMG hat on. We would not regard sanctions as self-harming. You will see that we've had plenty of bans, ban on the import of Russian oil in the UK, plenty of different regimes and different types of sanctions that so far have harmed the intended target rather than the UK. I would say that it's very much a case of balancing different interests, especially when working with our allies. And so because we tend to, and I use this word multilateral, not specifically just not with the UN in mind for very obvious reasons, but multilateral meaning through the G7, through bilaterally with the European Commission or with the US or G7 plus, so it could be Australia, New Zealand and so on. These take time, but that also what makes them fundamentally effective in the medium to longer term. Again, if you're trying to see the kind of effect of today we're imposing sanctions, tomorrow the war is over, that's probably something that I wouldn't see very likely to happen in general, but that we don't necessarily see that as a realistic standard. Sanctions contribute to our broader strategy. They can weaken that target state. I wouldn't say that. I think it's interesting when you look at actually this is an interesting case study for the oil price cap. Greece, in particular, was the Greek industry, the ship owner industry, charters, vessels, and so on. They have been impacted to some extent because they've lost some volume of the business back in 2022-23. And yet, Greece continues to be a member state that supports the oil price cap, and we do work with Greece on its enforcement. Which takes me back to the deter, disrupt, demonstrate. This is the UK strategy, but there is also an element of demonstrating our commitment. Sometimes we say, you know what, this might hurt some. That's obviously a decision for that particular country, but there might be some economic impact. But fundamentally, we believe that is the right thing to do, and so industry and that particular government might say we are willing to take the financial hit to the extent that there is a financial hit and agree to that particular sanction. So that is an example, I would say.
Chloe, would you like to answer the question about India and China being such growing economies that the West is whistling into the wind?
Yeah, I was going to finish off on this one, which was very much about sanctions are supposed to harm them more than they harm us. The reasons they were incremental in the context of Russia is because it's the first time we've sanctioned a G20 economy, had no idea what the impact was going to be, and it had to be staged because otherwise, and this is why we will not see sanctions on China in the way we've ever seen them against Russia, because of the integration, the depth of the financial integration that we have with China would make it way too unpredictable, and nobody could possibly carry out a study on what, for example, de-swifting Chinese banks would have on the world economy. I think it would collapse. That's my understanding. There's some great Yale and Harvard papers on it. But in terms of India and China, I haven't got a crystal ball, can't look 30, 40 years down the line. I think it's a good point. The big issue we've got, and it goes back to the crypto question earlier, is are there alternative payment mechanisms that can be used to support big economies, as you're saying, these huge, you're the economist, but huge economies, can they survive without access to the US dollar? Because that's essentially what you're saying. Because I didn't get to talk about secondary sanctions, but if they don't comply, what we saw with the Naira designation recently is, and this happens all around the ex-Soviet states as well, is there will be designations that can bring down economies, because it's either you're with them or you're with us. And I think with Russia and China, there have been great countermeasures, India and China, but there have been great countermeasures that China has been looking at what Russia has done and preparing itself. So if there are escalations which led to the invasion of Taiwan, China would know exactly what to implement in order to bolster its economy and support itself through the economic pain. But it would be very different. And I think sanctions are here to stay for quite a long time, maybe through my career, but perhaps not through to your retirement.
Victoria, quick further word, and then we'll have one more final quick round. Anything you want to add?
No, I think that was said actually perfectly. The only thing I do want to actually make a point on, though, is the Trump. Oh, sorry. Yeah, no, the only thing I do want to make a point, though, is I guess maybe it's kind of a combined thing, is the Trump situation, and he's a businessman, right? So the first thing that he will always do is go for the biggest hit that he thinks is going to impact the country, the individual, the business, whatever that may be, because he wants to get you to the table. And he's done that with China and 100% tariff. And, next week it's down to 50%. Well, if you come talk to me, I'll lower it down to 30%. And that's why I say I think it's a grandstand, because that is his way. That's what he does. That was the only thing I wanted to add to that. So.
Final round of questions. I think there were some hands on this side. Oh, I'm sorry, they're scattered all over the place. So, yes, the lady there in the middle. And then I'm afraid, hand back the microphone, if you could, and it's got to go all the way up to near the camera. Yes,
Hello,
go for it.
I'm Lizzie. It's nice to meet you all. I'm curious as to why these sanctions are not applied to the UK. It's quite a big question, but why they're not applied by other countries to the UK.
And to give us an example of, just tell us what's in your mind. Why should the UK be sanctioned?
Well, it's not that I think it should. I'm just curious as to if they're so effective, then why are other countries not using them?
Okay, right. Yes, pass the microphone that way. Thank you. And there was a hand towards the back up there. Yes. Sorry, it's got to go all the way across. Yes.
Hi, my question was, what's the difference between primary and secondary sanctions?
Good one, yeah. And then the man from Zimbabwe, he gets one more go, but a quick one, please.
My question was a response to Chloe around the targeting and how supposedly it's targeted, but my understanding is that once, if you've got more than 10 individuals in a country targeted, it goes into an investment yellow list or red list. So actually the country doesn't receive FDI, even if it's only 10 individuals. So it's still quite a broad thing. And what's your response to that? And last one is, how did sanctioning Syria benefit the UK?
Against Syria?
Yeah.
Okay. So, Olga, why doesn't China or Russia sanction the UK? Perhaps they have. Tell us.
So the answer is, sorry, thank you. The answer is they have, actually. There's lots of travel bans on UK officials, and there has been a fairly recent statement by the Russian MFA listing several UK officials as being banned from Russia or designated as undesirable persons in Russia. So that happens. Whether that's necessarily effective or not, I'll leave that up to you to decide. But it does absolutely happen. And it's one of the reasons why there's a duty of care that the UK government has towards its officials that work on national security and in the sanction space. So there would be countries that we might choose not to travel to as a result of that. They don't necessarily to be countries, speaking very personally, that I would necessarily feel the need to travel to. So I wouldn't say it's hugely impactful on my life. But yeah, they absolutely can and will happen. And just very, very quickly, in terms of, I'm sure Chloe can come back on this as well, but in terms of the difference between primary and secondary sanctions. Primary sanctions involve a particular nexus. So you need to kind of touch the system, I'm simplifying massively, but you need to touch the system of that particular country in order to engage sanctions. Secondary sanctions is basically something that the US is really good at, in the sense that the US can coerce, effectively, third countries or, private sector to comply with the sanctions, because otherwise they're effectively cut off from the US financial system. And the reason for that is because you have the dominance of the dollar on financial markets. And so effectively, if you have any transaction that involve US dollars, even if you're not in the US, your business is not in the US, your counterpart is also not in the US, but there's some sort of dollar somewhere, and usually there is because there's clearing that happens in dollars, then that gives the US the power to exert territorial jurisdiction over those transactions and impose secondary sanctions via that element. So it's very much a case of, just very quickly bringing this back to my original point, because we now have a globalized financial markets and the globalized financial system, that gives a lot of power to the US on one hand and the UK on the other, because again, a lot of banks have a connection to the UK. So we don't do secondary sanctions in the UK, but we are able to exert the UK, find the UK nexus, and then exert sanctions in that direction.
Chloe, can you also do red and yellow lists and Syria?
Not primary and secondary sanctions.
If you've got something to add.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Okay.
So jurisdictional nexus, that's what there has to be. So you've got dollars that have to be cleared in the US financial system, which establishes a jurisdictional nexus, which means US primary sanctions would apply. And if there was something that was prohibited, then it would be a breach of those sanctions. I think secondary sanctions is where there's extraterritorial reach of those sanctions, where they have application outside of the territory, and the territory is obviously broadly defined. But I like to think of it really in simplistic terms. Imagine you are driving your car, and I know that the US has really low speed limits, right? And the speed limit is set at 50 miles per hour, and you drive at 70 miles per hour, and you're driving your Lamborghini in the US, and when you get home to your house, you get a speeding ticket. And that's because primary sanctions have applied, right? Because you've contravened US speeding law, right? But then you go away to another country, you're not a US person, you're traveling in France, for example, and when you get back to your house, because you've been driving at 70 miles per hour, which is against the 50 miles per hour speed limit set by the US, you get a speeding fine. And you're like, well, hang on a minute. And it's because they are imposing their foreign policy objectives on you extraterritorially. Does that make a little bit more sense? Yeah, and that's what they do. But the EU has started to do it with its best efforts obligations. And it was in my day as an international lawyer at the Foreign Office, contrary to international law. Nobody accepted that secondary sanctions or any law with extraterritorial reach was lawful under international law. And now we're all doing it. There you go. Yellow and red lists. Grey lists, what about FATF? I mean, anything. I think you're talking about direct foreign investment and impact of basically being subject to any type of sanction. And I think you are seizing on Zimbabwe, right? No, you're not? So, I mean, Egypt suffered after the Arab Spring and the Mubarak regime fell and we had the replacement Sisi, but they still were able to acquire direct foreign investment, right, despite there being a number of members of the regime on sanctions lists. I don't think it's binary, but I do think as soon as I've got an instruction at the moment from the government of Kyrgyzstan, today in the 19th package, 2 of their banks were designated. The UK designated Capital One Bank in the summer, and the big concern about those 3 banks now being designated is it's going to bring down their whole financial system because it doesn't have integrity and nobody will have any trust. And I'm talking about correspondent banks, I'm talking about international partners, direct foreign investment, etc. And it's a really big problem. But if you think about a country like Latvia or Armenia or indeed Georgia, they are able to turn around their systems and reform their financial systems with breathing integrity back into them, health back into them for correspondent relationships and for financial investment in the future. But it takes many, many years. It's a very harmful foreign policy tool with which I agree with you. I'm not sure that's yellow and red, but yeah, sorry.
Victoria, unless there's something you're burning to add, we're going to have to wrap it up. Yeah, forgive me, because we're almost into injury time. So that's all we have time for. Before we thank our speakers, let me remind you about next week's Policy and Practice event, which is entitled The Rise and Fall of ESG and What Next for Sustainable Finance. So that's next Thursday on October the 30th. And you can sign up for it, as usual, via the website. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Would you please join me in thanking all our speakers?